Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Seema Mody, Global Markets Reporter, CNBC.
And I'd like to welcome our guests, Roger Dow, President and CEO of the U.S. Travel Association, Gloria Manzo, President and CEO, World Travel and Tourism Council, Mike Premo, President and CEO, Airlines Reporting Corporation, Chris Thompson, President and CEO, Brand USA. Our guests are just joining us here. As part of an executive roundtable, the topic today for this panel is travel in the age of Trump. We're hoping to have a provocative discussion about what's happening in the world of politics, the impact on this industry that many of us are involved in, whether it be reporter or investor, leader. So thank you all for joining us today. Appreciate it. Very excited to have this discussion. And let's start with the big question in the room, and that is, what is the impact of President Trump and his policies on the travel industry? And Roger, I'll ask you to kick it off, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure, Seema. You know, the world, the media world, your world especially, wants to say it's all Trump. There is a factor there, but the real factor on, we've got about 3% decline, is the strength of the dollar, weak economies, and now the perception that's starting. But everyone wants to say it's a Trump effect. There's a piece there, but it's a lot has to do with economy and dollar.
The data on inbound travel into the United States, what does it show us?
Right now, if you look at Commerce's numbers through May, they're a little slower of getting the numbers out, but their numbers say we're down about 2.8%. And when you look at that, every percent is $2.6 billion and 5,000 jobs. So a 1% move either way is big time, financially and job-wise.
So clearly implications for the U.S. economy, Gloria?
Well, that's interesting. What I can tell you also is from the World Travel and Tourism perspective, we represent the private sector globally, and there's a growth, 4% in the first quarter, 8% in the second quarter. So we see a lot of movement, and that's in international arrivals. We monitor 185 countries, and the growth is everywhere. And the U.S. is growing also domestic.
And Mike, what are you seeing in your world from the data perspective?
So 2016 versus 2015 was a great story. Both inbound and outbound up about 9%. 2017 is a little different story. Outbound is still up almost 7%. Inbound, we'd say, well, your numbers through May, we got a little bit more current.
Right.
We'd say down about 2%. Now, some of that is going to be some hurricane effect, but there are definitely pockets where maybe Trump policies are having an impact.
Chris, from your perspective, the impact on the travel ban and inbound travel into the United States?
So as Roger said, we are down slightly for all the reasons he said, which were way before actually the administration came on board. But one thing to counteract that is that for 2017, we have record spend. So we've had 9 months of month-over-month increases in spend. Through August, numbers were up 5% overall for the 9 months. Spend was up 3%. It's $168 billion, already a $54 billion balance of trade contribution. So even though the numbers are slightly down, the spend's up. And
I want to piggyback on something Gloria said, is international long haul is up. And this concerns me because for the first time, actually, we're seeing our share drift downwards, and that hasn't happened in about 5 to 8 years. So if the world is going up and we're going backwards, the delta is extremely important.
And what regions are we seeing the uptick in?
Where do I see the uptick? It's people that are going to places they see as easier to get through and get to. So Canada is making it very attractive, Australia, different places, and China is up. But the bottom line is travel will always go to the easiest path. So anytime things get in the way of path, whether it's financial or policy, that can have an impact.
And much of what we're dealing with is perception versus reality. What we're watching, onboarding a new administration, hot off the campaign, ideas about how policy ought to change is no different than any time you're welcoming a new administration. This administration is focusing on policy that has the potential to affect travel. But even given all the conversation and what has and actually hasn't happened, the majority of the people around the world that we require visas from, very little has changed. For the majority of people that are coming to the United States, very little has changed on how we're welcoming them to the United States. So our job has been to try to make sure that we separate the perception from the reality and make sure people realize that travel is all about the destination, the experiences, the people, us as Americans welcoming the world like no others. Nothing about that's changed. Everything about that is as good as it's ever been. It's probably better today than it was yesterday, be better tomorrow than it is today. So I think our job is to focus on that versus any of the noise that's out there.
But where we are seeing a significant decline in terms of arrivals into the United States is Mexico. Gloria, why do you think that is?
Well, I can see, for instance, more Mexicans, and that's based in our analysis, traveling to Canada. For instance, Canada is growing 2 digits.
So they're skipping the United States and going to Canada.
Yes, if you look at, for instance, during the summer, Canada grew like around 50%. But there are a couple of factors also that you have to consider. Canada removed the visas for Mexicans, which is very important. So it's very easy for Mexicans to travel to Canada without a visa. And on top of that, I think the dollar also had an impact. I think that's another factor. And yes, the perception, going back to the point of Chris, is a big thing. You don't want to feel unwelcome. And that could be another factor.
And you would say there are a strong group of people in Mexico who feel unwelcome coming to the United States, given the administration?
Well, it's not that they feel unwelcome. It's because once they are here, you feel welcome. I think it's very nice, great experience. There are some unique experiences in the U.S. that you don't find elsewhere. That's also very important. But I think it's just easier to go north at this point.
What would you tell the administration, if you could, about how to change this perception?
Well, that's a good question. It's a combination of factors. I think here is more like testimonials as well. Like a lot of Mexicans that come here and they have a great experience, use those to share back with the others that they are hesitant to travel in here. And also, I think with the visa processing, we have seen a big improvement as well.
Yes, Roger.
What we keep telling the administration is the message has to be around the world is America is closed to terrorists and wide open to everyone else. And they're getting the first part right. Now it's the second part that we've got to get the voice because at IPW, et cetera, we had one big welcome. But it can't be the industry. The administration has to do that. And security and travel aren't mutually exclusive, but they're obsessed with security. And actually, the more people that come here and go back home somewhere else, the better off we are, because they go home and say, what a great place, as Chris mentioned.
And on the flip side of that, any president, any leader of a nation, their highest priority is to protect their borders, to protect their citizens. And oh, by the way, when you do that, you protect the destination for our travelers. And so it does not mutually exclusive. This administration is just focusing on new ways to do things. And what we have to believe is that those decisions on security are being made for good reasons that we'll never know about because we're not privy to all that. But there is a way to do that with also extending the welcome message to say, hey, it's a welcoming environment, it's a safe place, and everything that has made it the most aspirational destination in the world, not a thing about that has changed.
Gloria, you travel a lot around the world. What are people saying outside the U.S. about travel into the mainland?
I think the experience, again, is what matters, and the facilitation to travel is very important. If we look at how easy it is just to move, not only within the U.S., but to all the airports around the world, right now is not the ideal state. And we know that in the private sector worldwide, we're working with the governments to come up with a standard, and here I know that we have a lot of experts. And we need that expertise because we would like to have a standard to use more biometrics. If we can help the governments increasing security by the use of biometrics, for instance, if my face is the recognition for me to check in at the airport, check in at the hotel, check in at the cruise, go through TSA, for instance, and make my life easier, that would be wonderful. Right. If you look at the data, for instance, from UNWTO, we are going to be growing 50% by 2030. So 1.8 billion people are going to be moving around the world. We need to make it easier. And we can have better security, but at the same time, more travelers and be able to create more jobs. Because at the end of the day, this industry is about also creating jobs.
Mike, what are you seeing in your world?
So just to size the market for a minute, year to date, we've had 17.4 million inbounds and 16.8 million outbounds.
Okay.
So they're markets that they're pretty close to the same, inbound slightly larger. And travel, I think, sort of to Gloria's point, is like politics. It's local. So you look at markets like Turkey, Pakistan, Kuwait, Saudi. They're down 15, 16% each, but they're very small markets. You're talking 100,000 tickets total from those 4 countries in difference. So you look at that against 16, 17 million, it's a pretty small impact that these kinds of policies have. But if it's happening to you, obviously it matters.
And how has that affected corporations, airlines who service that region in the Middle East?
Well, clearly the carriers are working very closely with FAA and DHS. Probably the biggest issue, I think, has been really the laptop
ban,
issue. Yeah,
right.
ban. So, the carriers I know they've had a lot of different contingency plans, and if something really serious came down to impact that, that's always a worry, I think, is there going to be a negative impact on the business traveler that's paying the bills?
Roger, what are your thoughts on the implementation of that rule on laptops? Clearly, it had an impact on corporate travel from the Middle East to the United States.
Well, I think anything that impedes travel is a challenge, but I do know that the laptop ban is due to a real threat. They've discovered some people that are trying to put explosive into laptops, so there's a real threat there. But we've got to get smart about it. We've got to use technology. We've got to, and this group could be very helpful. But get smart, because again, anything like that will cause people to go elsewhere. But there's a real threat there, and we've got to make sure, if something happens, your tourism gets turned off right away. You mentioned Turkey, Egypt, places like that. Turkey is such a great place to go, but is decimated because of fear of terrorism. Mm-hmm.
And that also speaks to the visa issue as well.
Yeah, and the visa program, and especially visa waiver, is very important to us. And I call it the best program with the lousiest name. Visa waiver sounds like we're looking the other way, but in reality, it's a layered security program that makes the U.S. much safer. But that's not understood, because visa waiver sounds like we're looking the other way. And without visa waiver, 60-70% of all of our inbound travel goes through the visa waiver program.
Gloria, is Turkey an example of how foreign policy can have an impact on relations between 2 countries, and then that, of course, feeds into consumer travel as well?
Well, Turkey is an interesting model because they also have very strong domestic traveling. And in the case of Turkey, yes, if you look at the first 5 months of the year and last year, actually, a lot of the travelers going to Turkey and the north of Africa, they moved, for instance, to Europe. That's why you have destinations like Spain, Greece, Italy, having a lot of Portugal also, a lot of travelers that in the past were choosing those destinations. Now, lately I can tell you that Turkey is getting better. However, the policy also is very important. Here is a couple of things in my mind. It's just not only the policy, it's how do you react to these situations, the transparency, managing the crisis, being proactive, it's everything.
And does it really come down to technology and finding more ways to increase security and safety, while at the same time not impacting the everyday traveler needs?
I think so. We at WTTC truly believe that there is an opportunity. It's kind of when, and I was just talking before the panel, when we migrated from manual ticketing to electronic ticketing many years ago, and I'm sure here a lot of people were part of that, it was painful. But it was a very interesting standard that it was adopted, that at the end of the day brought a lot of benefits. That standard came from the private sector, and the governments are using that today because they receive all that passenger information in advance. Now, if we use the technology to include in the PNR or to include in the ticket something equivalent to the biometrics, for instance, my face and my fingerprints, if that can be translated to 123G, for instance, that's like my vision, and we can provide that information in advance to the governments, and they know who I am. Hopefully, in the future, they will be able to allow me to go through the airport easily, fast, and without problems, because I am a trusted traveler, and not because I have a Mexican passport or I live in London, no? I think that's very relevant. The technology is going to provide a solution at the end of the day, and it's going to make our life easier, because what we care is that we want to create more jobs, we want to have more travelers, And we want to continue providing support to this wonderful sector.
Yeah.
So an analogy, Roger, you've used in the past is the security issue is about finding a needle in a haystack, and all these measures that are being put in place is to make the haystack smaller so that you can actually find the needle. So anything that we can do that's technology-wise or otherwise to make sure, as you said, that the legitimate travelers have few barriers, and then the terrorists are the ones that we're looking for.
I think one of the things the industry should be looking at is, and Gloria just mentioned it, is the ability to have a global visa or a global security program. Mexico did something that was brilliant years ago. They said, okay, the US vetting is fine by us. So if you have a US passport, you can come to Mexico. Think of how much money they saved, how much hassle they saved. And if you get the same, I just got back from, we're just in for WTM in London. Guess what, my Visa card worked everywhere. I can go to China and it will work. And the bottom line is, we've got to think that way from a security standpoint, and if we could ever get there, it would just boost international travel phenomenally. But it's got to get a lot of governments talking, and that's not easy.
Is that a priority, you think, for the Trump administration? Because the rhetoric tells us that's not.
My thought with the Trump administration, let's get them to say, America's open to everyone else, and we'll work about global integrity down the road. But it's something that has to come. But again, high security, we're all for it in the travel industry, but the voice of high security has been a little too loud versus the other voice of legitimate travelers.
You know, I think one of the things that public-private partnerships should work on is contingency planning. You look at what's happened in Napa, you look at what's happened in Las Vegas, you look at what's happened in Houston, Florida. The bounce back can be a lot quicker if you've got a contingency marketing plan so that when you do reopen, you tell people about it. Because we were seeing Vegas, continuing to be in a pretty good decline, and we're now, it seems like yesterday, but we're weeks into it, and the impact on that market's it's significant.
To his point, Las Vegas should be a Harvard case study on how to handle a bad incident. I mean, they did the right things within hours, and they communicated, they brought a community together, but now they're moving back and getting the word out, record numbers and all that. Case study, because all the time when these things happen, it can take 4 or 5 years to come back.
Yes.
Katrina, New Orleans, people still thought it was underwater 4 years later.
I couldn't agree more, because we have done research that proves exactly that. The best cases that we have are maximum 2 months, like Las Vegas.
Right.
And we have some cases with 45 months, the recovery.
When it pertains to Las Vegas, do you think hotels have to rethink the layout of their properties given this horrible event that happened?
We have the only business in the world where you can, for a $5 tip, get someone to deliver weapons or a gun or a bomb to your room. We're the only industry in the world where someone can ship AV equipment in boxes, and so we've got to have technology on those areas, but not overreact. I'm so afraid we'll go so far the other way, and you've got to have the ability to move in this world. You've got to have good security, but the best security is really listening to the folks, data, and it's not machines.
Chris, do you think hotels over time will become more like airports, elevated security at the entrance, metal detectors to ensure individuals who have bad intentions can't bring up weapons of some sort?
Well, I think obviously, given what happened in Vegas, that's something that has to be addressed. But I worry like Roger does. You can take it too far, and then you create barriers that actually feed the misperception about what's going on.
I want to pivot the discussion to another area of focus for us on CNBC, and I think in the foreign policy world, and that is North Korea, this geopolitical flashpoint, if you will. It's something that has been garnering a lot of attention from citizens, but also markets too, trying to understand, is there an economic impact, and has it at all disrupted the flow of travel? What are you seeing in your world?
For North Korea, well, what I can tell you is that the largest region in the world is Europe, but the largest in terms of growth is Asia, by far. Asia is doing something very interesting in terms of the multi-destination, the connectivity, the long haul, the visas as a region. And the growth is 2 digits. It's very impressive. Now, if you look at some Southeast Asia, for instance, is growing very interesting. China as well is growing very rapidly.
What about U.S. travel to the Korean Peninsula or that region? Has that been affected at all?
It's not showing up in our numbers. it's pretty consistent.
What is happening, the South Korea numbers are exploding. When we got visa waiver for South Korea, the numbers in 1 year went up 46%. Kim Jong-un could do a pivot and say, I want to invest in tourism. It would be amazing, because he's now got North Korea on the media worldwide.
Sure.
And if he could pivot to travel and tourism, it could serve him well.
There's a lot of curiosity, right, as to what's happening
that.
inside that country.
We actually have a question on the floor.
Yeah, I'm curious about the long-term implications on business travel. It seems that a lot of the policies going on today with regards to travel bans or specific countries one day, then different countries the next, what impact is that having on the rest of the world looking at the U.S. and saying, hey, do I want to do business with them or not? And how is that going to impact business travel in the long run, whether it's travel bans, whether it's tax laws, whether it's border patrol? It just seems like there are a lot of things the administration is talking about that could potentially impact businesses wanting to work with the U.S.
I'll take that one. From business travel, for individual business travel coming here, we've not seen a factor. People want to do business here, they come do it. Where the risk is in conventions and meeting space, and that's where the large purchases happen. So you take the heavy equipment show or technology show and things like that. If you don't have the foreign buyers coming, you've got a problem. 10 years ago, everyone was screaming because the international buyers couldn't get to these places because they couldn't get visas. And so if it gets harder for people to attend conventions and trade shows, then the conventions and trade shows will go to Dubai, Singapore, Shanghai, elsewhere. So that's the risk from a business standpoint, I think, is the big trade shows, not so much the individual business traveler.
I agree with that. I think that you look at what has the biggest impact on travel this year, it's actually currency. We've had 3 million fewer trips from the UK because of Brexit and the pound dropping.
The weak pound.
On the other hand, we've got 1 million more trips going to England. So, I mean, that's a direct result of currency, which is, it was a political
So, sorry,
decision.
3 million fewer British tourists to the United States because of the pound, the weakness of the pound?
Yeah, that's a strong dollar.
And that's over the past 1 year?
But along the lines of what Roger was saying also, we were created in 2010. In 2012, the president called for it, and we now have a national travel and tourism strategy. A lot due to the work that Roger's done over the tenure he's been at U.S. Travel and the focus of travel in the prior administration. We now have an understanding of travel and tourism as a major driver to the economic engine, as a major contributor to diplomacy as it relates to bringing people and cultures together. And I can tell you that as it relates to business travel, understanding that a lot of the worry about the big conventions is whether people from out the international market could come in. They have a whole section dedicated within DHS, which is targeted on those instances to be able to facilitate when they can to make sure that that friction level is as little as it can be.
That's a good point. Yes, Roger.
But one thing I'd like to look forward, if we went back 10 years, and we were sitting here 10 years ago, and I started talking about China travel, this group would look at me and go, "Are you crazy?" We're talking 250, 300,000 Chinese. Now we're talking 3 million. I think the next frontier, and I think it's 10 years away, is Africa. And to look at what's going to go in Africa, the change in Africa, and we should be thinking about Africa. And one of the concerns I have is a lot of our carriers aren't serving the Southeast Asia and Africa, and that's very important because 10 years from now we'll all be talking about Africa. Not right now, but we will.
Yeah, it's an important part of the story. I believe you have another question.
Yeah, my question's regarding how domestic policies affect international travel. We've been hearing about international policies, something like gun control, and the recent media attention that more countries get to know about how easy it's to own a gun in a country like US. How do those policies affect international travel?
Good question.
The way we talk about it is certainly that we've had more instances than usual of random acts of violence, some of them being random acts of terrorism. It's really become the way the world is these days. And so no more prevalent here in the United States than in many other parts of the world. It is getting more media attention, so our job is to focus on the fact that it is random and it is no worse than anywhere else. And we focus on the fact that the amazingness of the destination is still here. It's probably safer today than it's ever been, and to be able to come to the United States and I don't know that you're ever going to be able to stop those random acts of violence, no matter how.
No, Chris, and I think one of the things is we've done a lot of research, and people have the ability to separate politics and place. We all go to places in the world that we may not exist with their foreign rights policy or the human rights policy or how their government operates, but we do want to go and see their sites. And the same thing, that's as good up to a point. And when that point hits a tipping point, then it becomes a problem. But right now, people are able to put the policy and what's happening domestically behind them to say, I want to go to Las Vegas, I want to go to California. And right now, that's good, and I agree with Mike, it's more dollar than it is policy.
And the aspirational nature of the destination is as strong as it's ever been, and
Yeah.
that's been able to overcome some of those headwinds.
One thing I would also point out is that this is the first president who's a hotelier and has been an airline CEO. So
Do you think that's had a positive impact on the hotel landscape? Because hotels, by the way, stock-wise, and they've done incredible this year. Marriott is up 50%, Hyatt, Wyndham, they've all had a pretty strong year. A lot of that due to corporate travel.
when you look at, again, when you quantify the numbers, so inbound's down 350,000 tickets, but domestic is up 1.7 million.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of the effect of this, if you're a hotelier or a destination of some kind, is being masked by the very strong domestic market.
So the decline in international arrivals is being offset by
the
domestic
domestic.
travel.
Yeah.
That is very important, and we need to keep that in perspective. Yes, international is huge, but domestic is very relevant. In a lot of these countries, for instance, 85% of the contribution is domestic, directly to the GDP. And that's something that we have seen in this market and many other markets. Going back to China, for instance, yes, a lot of Chinese are traveling international, but we have 5 billion trips of Chinese within China. Now they're trying to figure out how to manage the volumes because they are tremendous.
And Chris, what's behind the domestic travel story? Is it economic growth, the prospect of tax reform?
I can't speak specifically about the domestic market. Roger, you
I
can.
think all of it. I think domestic leisure travel, as Mike has said, has been the darling of this industry.
Sure has.
67% of all of our travel is leisure. And if I was the President of the United States, I would come out and say, it's now time to see America. And I would talk Buy America, Hire America, travel, because we're so labor intensive, and I would get behind, and I'd push even harder on leisure, and then I'd work behind the scenes to do the right things to get international travel.
Yeah, and to play on what I think the question you asked earlier, if you had a chance to talk to the president, to talk to people in the administration, what would you say? Well, the president, as you said, is from the hospitality industry. Most of his cabinet and administration are all about economics and trade and jobs. Travel and tourism is a major engine to all of that, and I think all we're saying, all you're saying is, we understand that security is the highest priority, but international travel and tourism is 11% of all the exports of the largest economy in the world. It fuels jobs, it creates a huge economic contribution to our economy. So you can be secure, but then also be an ambassador to say, we welcome you to come. We don't, like you said, we're open to legitimate travel, we're closed to
Plus,
terrorists.
our business touches every state. In this, if I ask people to raise their hand here, this group comes from about 8 different areas in the United States. Very heavy West Coast, very heavy technology areas, very heavy corporate headquarters. But you look at travel, it's in Fargo and Fort Lauderdale. It's in Manhattan, Manhattan Beach. And
Sure.
so this industry touches every state, which is very rare for an industry.
We're coming to the end of our discussion. If there's one thing you would tell Washington, the administration, about how we can improve travel, what would it be? One sentence.
My one thing would be understand this is the darling of the economy. It's the front door to economic development. International travelers buy $52 billion a year in real estate. Understand it's not about just fun and travel. It's about how to drive the U.S. economy.
Gloria?
My one thing will be the partnership between the public and the private sector is crucial to be successful. The private sector creates the jobs, but they need the support from the public sector. So here, as long as we work together and we have the right policies, the right message, the right facilitation, we can continue working together to help their agenda to create jobs.
Mike?
It's a big, big market, and don't mess it up.
I like that.
Travel and tourism, over a third of service exports, 11% of everything that we export. It's the quickest way to jobs and economic development. It's also bringing people and cultures together, so all the issues we have all over the world, or that the world has with us, when they come here, they experience the aspirational nature of the destination. They every time leave with a more positive opinion about the U.S. So help us have that, maximize that impact.
And thank you for having this discussion with us, Roger, Gloria, Mike, and Chris.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Seema.
everyone.
What stresses me out the most about traveling is probably getting through the security lines.
Definitely delayed flights.
Getting to the airport on time.
Having my bags lost.
Check-in times and security.
There's just people everywhere and it's overwhelming and there's crowds and there's pushing.
I think the biggest thing is making sure that I get to the airport with enough time to sit down at the bar and have my pre-flight cocktail.